Welcome to the deep dive. Ready to get into tariffs? We're going to figure out how these taxes on imported goods can impact, pretty much everything from how much you pay for avocado toast to like global power dynamics.
It's a lot, yeah, but we'll break it down together. But the end of this, you'll be a tariff pro.
Awesome. Okay, so let's rewind a bit first. How did we even get here? Like historically?
Well, the story of tariffs in the U.S., it all goes back to, a brand new government that needed money. Back in 1789, that very first Tariff Act under President Washington, it was all about funding the government, the essential stuff, and paying off those Revolutionary War debts.
Practicality over ideology, right? Makes you wonder if they ever imagined us still arguing about tariffs all these centuries later. But before we get to the modern day stuff, let's talk about the big ideas behind it all. Protectionism versus free trade.
Yeah, those are the two main camps. Protectionism is all about shielding domestic industries from foreign competition, and they often use tariffs to do that. The goal there is to protect jobs and industries within a country, but the downside is that it can lead to higher prices for consumers.
So it's kind of like building a wall around your economy to keep out the competition, but then the people stuck inside it and they're paying more for things?
Yeah, that's the trade-off. Now, free trade advocates for, well, free trade, getting rid of those barriers like tariffs and letting goods flow freely between countries. The idea is that everyone benefits through what's called specialization. Countries focus on producing what they're best at, and that should lead to lower prices and more choices for consumers.
Sounds pretty ideal, but there's got to be a catch, right?
There always is. The big argument against free trade is that it can displace jobs. If a company can find cheaper labor or materials somewhere else, they might just up and move their operations, leaving workers behind.
Seems like both codes have a point. Is the answer somewhere in between?
Most likely, a successful trade policy needs a good balance. You want to encourage economic growth and keep prices down, but you also can't leave entire industries and their workers in the dust.
Okay, let's talk about some real-world impacts now. How do tariffs actually show up in our day-to-day lives?
Think about your grocery list. Like avocados, tariffs on those imported avocados can make that guacamole a little more expensive.
Ouch. And what about like all our gadgets and stuff?
Smartphones are a good example. Tariffs on things like semiconductors, which are imported, can actually drive up the price of that new phone you've been wanting.
So these tariffs are kind of sneaky then. They pop up everywhere from groceries to our tech.
They really do, and it doesn't stop there. The impact spreads to all sorts of sectors in the economy. Take agriculture, for instance.
Yeah, farming seems like it would be hit pretty hard.
Absolutely. It's a double whammy for farmers. They face higher costs for imported equipment because of tariffs, and then tariffs on agricultural products themselves can really mess with the prices of crops and livestock.
And manufacturing too. I imagine global supply chains get pretty tangled up when you throw tariffs into the mix.
I gotta think about it. A lot of manufacturers rely on imported raw materials or components. When you hit them with a tariff, those costs go up and it becomes more expensive to make goods. And then that cost, it gets passed along to businesses and eventually to consumers.
It's like a domino effect. One price increase leads to another.
Exactly. And we haven't even touched on the potential for disruptions to the supply chain itself, delays, shortages, all that fun stuff.
Speaking of domino effects, let's talk about the biggest tariff drama in recent memory, the U.S.-China trade war.
Yeah, that one really shook things up. Starting back in 2018, the U.S. and China got into this tit-for-tat tariffs battle, slapping tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods.
What were some of the big consequences? I remember hearing about soybean farmers a lot back then.
Oh, they were right on the front lines. China's a huge buyer of U.S. soybeans, so when they retaliated with tariffs on soybeans, U.S. exports just plummeted. To help those farmers out, the U.S. government ended up having to step in with billions of dollars in aid.
Wow, so it was a huge financial hit that required a major government response.
It really shows you how these trade wars can have massive impacts on specific industries. And there were other consequences, too. The trade war forced a lot of companies to completely rethink their supply chains. They started moving production out of China to get around those tariffs.
It sounds like a game of economic chess with each side trying to outmaneuver the other. And while we're talking about specific examples, those steel and aluminum tariffs the U.S. imposed in 2018 come to mind.
Oh yeah, those definitely had a ripple effect. Those tariffs led to higher prices for all kinds of things, cars, construction materials, even beer cans.
Wait, so my beer got more expensive because of tariffs on steel and aluminum?
You got it. And of course, other countries hit back with their own tariffs on U.S. goods, which led to even more trade conflicts.
It makes you think about the long-term consequences of all of this.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. We'll dig into those long-term consequences in part 2 of our deep dive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're continuing our look at tariffs, and this time we're going global.
That's right. U.S. tariff policies, they don't just exist in isolation. They have this ripple effect that spreads across the entire world, affecting everything from diplomatic relations to how global trade works.
It's like a chain reaction, right? One action leads to another and another. So how do these U.S. tariffs actually impact our relationships with other countries?
Well, it's complicated. Sometimes tariffs can cause friction, leading to diplomatic tensions and even trade wars like we call with China. But on the other hand, they can actually be a starting point for negotiation and new trade agreements.
So they're like a double-edged sword. They can escalate tensions or force countries to the negotiating table.
Exactly. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, it's a good example of how trade tensions and those concerns about tariffs can lead to a renegotiation of trade terms.
So the USMCA was basically an update to NAFTA.
That's right. It tackled a lot of the issues that had been brewing for a while, including those worries about tariffs and unfair trade practices. But it's not just about those bilateral relationships. U.S. tariffs can also impact the bigger picture of multilateral trade, especially within the World Trade Organization, or WTO.
The WTO is like the referee of global trade, right? Making sure everyone's playing by the rules. So how do U.S. tariffs disrupt that system?
Well, when a big player like the U.S. starts throwing tariffs around, it can really throw a wrench in the whole system. Other countries might challenge those tariffs through the WTO, arguing that they're breaking international trade rules, and that can lead to these long legal battles and even trade sanctions.
Sounds messy.
It can be. And on a more fundamental level, U.S. tariffs can actually influence global trade policies and norms. When the U.S. raises tariffs, it can kind of embolden other countries to do the same thing, leading to a rise in protectionism around the world.
Which is basically the opposite of what the WTO is trying to do with free trade.
Exactly. The WTO is all about promoting free trade and open markets, but when countries start throwing tariffs back and forth, it creates this domino effect of protectionist measures. It undermines those efforts, and it could even harm the global economy as a whole.
It's like a game of chicken with each country daring the other to back down. But while governments are busy posturing, how are businesses adapting to this whole turbulent trade landscape?
They have to be adaptable. When U.S. tariffs make it more expensive to import goods from certain countries, businesses start looking for alternatives. They might diversify their supply chains, sourcing goods from different countries that haven't been hit by tariffs.
So instead of putting all their eggs in one basket, they're spreading them out to minimize risk.
Exactly. And some companies might even move their entire production to those other countries. We saw that happen during the trade war, with China companies started shifting operations to other countries to avoid those tariffs.
So in a way, U.S. tariffs might actually be speeding up the diversification of global trade-pushing companies to explore new markets and build relationships with different suppliers around the world.
That's a good point. It's not always as simple as tariffs equal less trade. It can be more nuanced than that. These shifting trade patterns can also have some interesting consequences for economic immigration, especially when you look at regional trade blocs.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are regional trade blocs and how do they fit into all of this?
A regional trade bloc is basically a group of countries that have agreed to lower or completely get rid of trade barriers among themselves. The European Union is a perfect example. They have a single market and a customs union, which means goods can move freely between member states without any tariffs or quotas.
That sounds pretty good for those countries.
It can be. And these regional trade blocs, they can become even more important in a world where U.S. tariffs are creating uncertainty and messing with those traditional trade flows. Think about it. If you're a business in, let's say, Vietnam, and you're watching all this drama unfold between the U.S. and China with tariffs flying left and right, you might start thinking it's time to focus on strengthening those trade ties with your neighbors in Southeast Asia.
It's like finding safety in numbers.
Exactly. And that's where regional trade blocs like the RCEP come in. It stands for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership.
RCEP, that's a new one.
It's a huge free trade agreement that includes 15 countries in the Asia-Pacific region, including China, Japan, South Korea, and Australia.
Wow, that's a lot of economic power in one group.
It is, and the goal of the RCEP is to reduce tariffs, streamline customs procedures, and promote investment among its members.
So it's like creating a counterbalance to all that uncertainty caused by U.S. tariffs. It gives businesses in the region a more stable and predictable trading environment.
That's a great way to put it. And this trend of regional integration isn't just happening in Asia. We're seeing similar developments in Africa and Latin America.
So U.S. tariffs might actually be unintentionally encouraging the formation of these regional trade blocs all over the world.
That's definitely a possibility. It just shows how interconnected the global economy really is. Actions taken by one country, even a powerful one like the U.S., can have these unintended consequences that ripple outward and completely reshape the landscape of trade.
Okay, so we've talked about how U.S. tariffs can impact trade relationships and regional integration. What about investment flows? Does all this drama affect foreign direct investment or FDI?
It can, for sure. Foreign direct investment is when a company from one country makes a significant investment in a business or asset in another country.
So things like building a factory or buying a company overseas.
Right. And tariffs can influence those investment decisions in a couple of ways. First of all, tariffs can make it more expensive to import goods from certain countries, which might make businesses hesitant to invest there.
I mean, if it's going to cost you an arm and a leg to get your products into a certain market because of tariffs, why even bother setting up shop there?
Exactly. So businesses might decide to shift their FDI to countries with better trade policies or lower tariffs barriers. They go where the business is good, as they say. But here's the thing. Tariffs can also create opportunities for FDI in certain sectors.
Okay, I don't quite follow. How can tariffs create opportunities?
Let's say a country puts tariffs on imported steel to protect its own steel industry. Now imagine a foreign company that's really good at making high-grade steel sees this and thinks, hey, if we build a factory in that country, we can avoid those tariffs and get into a protected market.
So they're basically using the situation to their advantage to gain a competitive edge.
Exactly. In this case, tariffs can actually attract FDR by making the environment more favorable for certain industries. So it's not always a simple equation of tariffs equal less investment. It's more complicated than that depending on the specific industry and what's happening in the market.
This is definitely more nuanced than I initially thought. It's like a giant economic puzzle with all these cases fitting together.
That's a good analogy. And all these factors we've discussed, trade relations, regional integration, investment flows, they all feed into the bigger geopolitical implications of U.S. tariff policies.
Okay, let's talk geopolitics then. Feels like we're about to step into a minefield.
It's definitely a complex and sensitive area. We've already touched on how tariffs can strain relationships between countries and even trigger trade wars like we saw with the U.S. and China.
Yeah, that one was hard to ignore.
Right. But it goes beyond that. Tariffs can get tangled up with other geopolitical issues like national security concerns, technological competition, and even human rights.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. It sounds like tariffs are more than just an economic tool. They can be a weapon in a larger geopolitical struggle.
They can be. Think about tariffs on critical minerals or rare earth elements, for example.
Those are crucial for all sorts of high-tech products, right? Like smartphones and electric vehicles.
Exactly. And if a country relies heavily on another country for those critical materials, it creates a strategic vulnerability. Tariffs can be a way to lessen that vulnerability by encouraging domestic production or finding other sources for those materials.
So it becomes a matter of national security, not just economics.
Right? The same logic applies to technological competition. Tariffs can be used to protect domestic industries that are developing cutting-edge technologies like artificial intelligence or 5G wireless networks.
It's like a high-stakes game of chess with each country trying to outmaneuver the other in this race for technological dominance.
That's a great way to put it. And then there's the human rights aspect.
Okay, I'm curious about this one. How do human rights fit into the world of tariffs?
Well, imagine a situation where a country is accused of using forced labor or violating human rights in its manufacturing industry. Some countries might use tariffs to put pressure on that country to improve its human rights record.
So it's like an economic sanction with a moral purpose. They're using trade policy to promote values and principles, not just economic interests.
Exactly. Tariffs can be a really powerful tool for all sorts of reasons, but they're also a blunt instrument. They can have unintended consequences and create these ripple effects that are hard to predict or control.
It's like playing with fire. You got to be careful.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to understand how complex tariffs are and how they impact the world. It's not just about the price of goods, it's about trade relationships, geopolitics, human rights, and the future of the global economy.
It's not just about the price of goods. It's about all these relationships, power dynamics, and global forces that shape our world.
Exactly. It's a fascinating and complex topic and one that we'll continue to explore in part 3 of our deep dive, where we'll delve into the future of tariffs.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've gone through the history of tariffs, looked at how they impact industries and global trade, and even dip our toes into the world of geopolitics. So now it's time to look ahead. What's next?
Predicting the future, it's always a bit of a gamble, but looking at current trends and how the global economy is changing, I think we can expect some pretty interesting developments when it comes to tariffs.
Okay, so give us a sneak peek into what the future might hold. What should we be paying attention to?
Well, one thing I think we'll see is a shift towards more strategic and targeted tariffs. Instead of those big sweeping measures we've seen in the past, Governments are probably going to focus on specific sectors or technologies that are seen as vital for national security or economic competitiveness.
So it's about being more picky, choosing your battles.
Exactly. We're already seeing this happening with tariffs that target things like advanced technologies, critical minerals, and pharmaceuticals. Governments are realizing that these sectors are really important strategically, and they're using tariffs to protect their own industries and rely less on foreign suppliers.
It's not just about protecting jobs or boosting exports anymore. It's about protecting national security and staying ahead in technology in a world that's changing so fast.
Exactly. And speaking of a changing world, I think those regional trade agreements are going to become even more important in shaping global trade. Remember the RCEP, that huge free trade agreement in the Asia Pacific?
Yeah, we talked about that earlier.
That's a perfect example of this trend. It's all about strengthening those economic ties within a region, getting rid of tariffs between member countries, and boosting investment within that bloc. And it's not just the RCEP. We're seeing similar regional trade agreements popping up all over the place, from Africa to Latin America.
It's like countries are forming their own little free trade zones, almost like a counter movement to all the protectionism and uncertainty from those global trade wars.
That's a great way to put it. These regional trade agreements give businesses a sense of security and stability so they can plan for the long term and make those big investments.
Makes sense. If you can't rely on the global trade system to be fair and predictable, you might as well build your own little free trade haven with your allies.
Exactly. And this isn't just limited to traditional trade either. Digital trade and e-commerce are becoming huge, and I think we'll see tariffs playing a role there too.
Wait, digital tariffs, that's a new one. What does that even mean?
It's still a pretty new idea, but it basically means putting tariffs on digital goods and services, things like cross-border data flows, online platforms, and digital subscriptions.
Wow, that's a whole new world of tariffs. But it makes sense. I mean, as more and more of our economy moves online, governments are going to want to find ways to regulate and tax those digital transactions.
Exactly. And it brings up a lot of complicated questions about how to define and put a value on digital goods, how to enforce those tariffs, and how to make sure there's a level playing field for businesses operating in the digital world.
It's a whole new law game for trade policy, and I'm really interested to see how it all plays out.
It'll be fascinating, that's for sure. And as we move further into the 21st century, I think sustainability and environmental concerns are also going to become major factors in shaping tariff policies.
Okay, tell me more about that. How does sustainability and tariffs connect?
Well, we're already seeing the rise of green tariffs. Basically, these are tariffs that are put on goods or services that are produced in ways that harm the environment or have a big carbon footprint.
So it's like using tariffs to encourage sustainable production and consumption. Governments are trying to nudge companies towards cleaner technologies and reducing their impact on the environment.
Exactly. It's all about aligning trade policies with environmental goals, using tariffs as a tool to push for a more sustainable global economy.
I bet consumers are loving this. People are more and more aware of how their purchases impact the environment, and they're willing to spend a bit more for products that are made ethically and sustainably.
You're absolutely right that consumer demand is powerful. It encourages businesses to go green and pushes governments to put policies in place that support sustainable production.
Sounds like a win-win. We get a healthier planet, a more sustainable economy, and hopefully even better products down the line.
That's the idea. And we can't talk about the future of tariffs without thinking about all the geopolitical shifts that are happening around the world.
Yeah, the rise of new global powers, changes in economic influence, the possibility of more competition and conflict. It's a lot to think about.
It really is. And all these factors are going to shape how tariffs are used in the future. For example, as countries like India, Brazil, and different African nations become bigger economic players, they're going to have more influence over global trade rules and policies that could lead to new alliances, new trade agreements, and maybe even new conflicts over tariffs and trade barriers.
It's not just a game between the U.S. and China anymore. The world's becoming more multipolar, with all these centers of economic and political power competing with each other.
You got it. And that makes predicting the future of tariffs even harder. It's like we're sailing into uncharted territory, and there are a lot of unknowns out there.
It's a little scary but exciting, too. It feels like we're seeing a new era of global trade taking shape with all its complexities and possibilities.
I agree. And that's exactly why it's so important to understand tariffs, their history, how they affect the economy, what they mean for geopolitics. It's not just about the price of something, it's about this whole web of relationships, power dynamics, and global forces that shape the world we live in.
Knowledge is power. And with that knowledge, we can navigate this changing landscape of global trade, make smart decisions as consumers and citizens, and hopefully help create a more sustainable and fair future for everyone.
Well said. This deep dive into tariffs has been quite the journey.
It really has. We've covered so much from the history of tariffs to their potential impact on the future of the global economy. We've learned about protectionism versus free trade, the rise of those regional trade blocs, the emergence of digital tariffs, and how important sustainability is becoming in trade policy. It's complex and it's always changing, but we've given you the tools and knowledge to understand it all.
And remember, this is just the start of your exploration. The world of tariffs is always evolving, so stay curious, keep learning, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
That's right, and be sure to check out the show notes for all the sources we used in this episode and some extra resources to help you keep diving deeper into the fascinating world of tariffs.
Until next time, happy learning.